Hey, I'm Dave Knight with the Dave Knight Real Estate team, and we love being a real estate resource for people. Let me ask you something. If home prices were really going to come down, wouldn't we be seeing it clearly by now? We've had higher mortgage rates for quite a while. Inventory has improved in certain parts of the country, and buyers aren't bidding aggressively the way that they were just 2 or 3 years ago. So it makes sense that a lot of people, especially people we've talked to, are thinking, okay, this has to be the year that prices finally come down and hit that affordable point. But once you step back from the noise and focus on the actual numbers, the situation isn't as simple as it feels. Yes, the market has shifted. Yes, things have cooled from the buyer frenzy that we experienced where there was literally lines out in front of properties. But cooling off and coming down are two very different things. So today, let's look at what the numbers are actually saying and what that means for you if you're buying or selling in 2026. No drama or fear-based predictions, just data and perspective. So let's start with what the national data is actually telling us. The Federal Housing Finance Agency, or FHFA, releases a quarterly home price index that tracks home values that go across the country. So they're pulling countrywide data. In its most recent report for Q1 in 2026, prices are still up compared to the same time last year. So the growth rate is much slower than what we saw during the pandemic surge, but it's still positive. That matters because when people talk about a housing correction or a crash, what they're usually imagining is just a broad national price decline across the board. And that's simply not what the data is showing. Now let's look at Zillow. Zillow's home value index also shows that US home values are slightly higher than what they were a year ago. Now, is Zillow accurate? It's about $500,000 off on my own property, and yet they have good national data. So again, we're not talking about modest growth here, not dramatic or overheated, but not negative territory either. Then we have Redfin's report from 2026, and that's their housing forecast. Redfin's projecting roughly a 1% price growth nationally this year. It's steady and measured, and it lines up with what we're seeing in the other reports. So there's some consistency there. And that's a very different environment from 2021. And it's also very different from the collapse we saw in 2008, back when I started in real estate, and it was just an avalanche. So when you step back and look at the broader picture, the pattern is very consistent. The growth has cooled, things are more balanced now, but prices aren't really falling nationally. Homes are still expensive, monthly payments are high because of the mortgage rates, and first-time buyers are really getting stretched because of those payments. So emotionally, it feels like prices should be correcting, but here's what's happening instead. So higher mortgage rates really cooled the demand. But what they did was they locked homeowners into these low rate mortgages from several years ago. And that limited the number of people that became willing to sell. So less sellers, because who wants to sell when they have a 3% rate and they're having to buy at 6 or 7%. So even if they're in, and I'm thinking of a family right now that's in too small of a home, but they don't want to give up that mortgage to buy the bigger home that they need. So supply just never really surged the way that some expected. And many markets were still dealing with relatively tight inventory, not extreme shortages like before, but not oversupply either. And when supply stays tight, even the softer demand isn't always able to push prices down significantly. And that balance is what's holding prices really steady right now. Buyers are more cautious, sellers are more realistic, but neither side is desperate. And markets don't crash when both sides are relatively feeling stable. Looking ahead, most forecasts remain conservative but steady. Redfin expects about 1% growth nationally this year. Zillow anticipates modest appreciation as well. And FHFA's data continues to really show year-over-year gains. So when several independent reports show the same trend, that adds credibility, but it doesn't mean that every city is experiencing the same conditions. There are pockets, especially in like oversupplied metro areas, where prices have softened, and we may see a little more of that in specific markets. Local conditions can vary depending on inventory levels, job growth, and buyer demand in that area. But nationally, the data does not support the idea of a broad housing downturn. What we're seeing is normalization. The market has shifted from rapid acceleration to a steadier pace, and that's actually healthier long term. So what does this mean for buyers? If you're waiting for a dramatic drop in home prices, the data suggests that that may not be the most likely outcome. However, buyers today may have advantages that didn't exist a few years ago. Less bidding competition, more inventory choices, and more negotiation flexibility. So for example, we just negotiated a purchase for a client where it was contingent upon the sale, which is pretty rare for that to be able to happen. So those factors can sometimes create more opportunity than a small price decline would. In other words, you may not see lower prices, but you may see better terms. And in many cases, that can have just as much of an impact in your overall investment. Now, what does this mean for sellers? For sellers, this is no longer a name your own price market. The pricing strategy, presentation, and getting the house ready for being on the market, how it looks, that is essential because buyers are comparing more carefully now. They've got options, and that means positioning your property is everything. But with that, values are not collapsing. In most markets, well-positioned homes are still selling at stable levels. The sellers who win in this market are the ones who price realistically from the start. Starting is essential, and presentation, presenting their home in a way that makes it stand out from the competition. So are home prices finally coming down in 2026? Nationally, the data says no. What we're seeing instead is stabilization. The rapid run-up we experienced a few years ago has leveled off, but broad price declines just aren't showing up in the national numbers. Now, what's happening across the country and what's happening here in our neighborhoods here in Southern California can be two very different things. Real estate's local. That's where the real story is. You can even within one city have different what we call micro markets going on. So if you're wondering what this means for your home's value or your buying power, let's take a closer look at your specific market. So you can reach out to schedule a one-on-one strategy call and we'll build a plan that makes sense for you this year. So if you found this breakdown helpful, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss future market updates and practical real estate insights. Make it a great day, and we'll see you on the next video.